VCT Americas Stage 1 has concluded. We are now heading into VCT Masters Shanghai. But before we get to that, we're going to be looking at which players had the best stats during the stage. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, and today we're talking about players that had very good stats during the VCT Americas stage. We're going to be looking at many different categories of stats. I did one of these videos after Masters Madrid, and it was an interesting experiment. I wanted to see what stats people really cared about, what stats people thought were useful, and what stats people thought were useless. But the problem with looking at stats from these international tournaments is that most of the top players are going to be players that were on the winning team. But since VCT Americas was a regular season format, a lot of these players played the same amount of games, or at least a similar amount of games. But even so, it is interesting to me to look at the stats from that regular season stage and see which players came out on top. So this is the board we have today. Obviously, there are a lot of stats here, so we're going to be going through all of it. Now, just from a quick look, you can see that a lot of these players show up multiple different times. There's a lot of Aspas, there's a lot of Oxy, there's a lot of Kesnet, and that's not really a huge surprise based off of how those players performed during the regular season stage. But even so, there are some interesting results that we can see on this board, so we're going to be going through each stat. Starting with ACS, which is average combat score, which is how Riot ranks players even in your ranked game. Oxy placing first in this category to no one's surprise. He had 291.1 average combat score. Very good numbers there. Bit of a surprising drop to number 2, Aspas, who had 260.1, but that's probably due to the two losses that his team suffered in playoffs. So Oxy, a player that didn't go very far in playoffs, only playing that one match and losing it, having a better average combat score while playing about 2 less matches. Kesnet played one more than Oxy, but he had 250.2 ACS, losing 2 of the playoff matches that he played. So knowing that all 3 of these players are primarily duelist players, it comes as no surprise that these 3 players are here, and it won't be the last time they show up. Moving on to VLR rating, which is how that website ranks the impact of each player. Aspas tops this list with a very solid 1.25 rating. Oxy and Cryo tied at number 2 at 1.22. What is interesting to note that while I talked about with Masters Madrid where a lot of players that were on the top of these categories were players from Sentinels because, well, they won the whole thing. But with 100 Thieves being the winner of the VCT Americas stage, we actually only see 2 players from that team on a couple different categories. And maybe that could be attributed to the fact that 100 Thieves weren't super good right away, but it is interesting because they did end up playing a fair amount of matches because they went all the way. Moving on to KPR, which is kills per round, which is probably the most valuable of the kill-based stats. Getting kills per round is a very important thing, especially if you're a duelist player such as Oxy, who had 1.01. Aspas a close second with a surprisingly below 1, 0.95 kills per round for him, and then Cryo at third with 0.88. I'm a bit surprised Aspas's isn't at least a little bit closer to Oxy's. Not that it's very far off, but it is probably due to the fact that his team lost 2 matches in playoffs, even though he had that insane match against G2 that went the distance. But moving on to total kills, we see Aspas show up once again at number 1. He had 519 kills. This absolutely is helped by the fact that he got 101 during his last match of the stage, which was also matched by Valen, who got 101 as well, and he shows up as well on this list. Leaf, a bit of a surprising second there. He had 458 kills total, and then Valen 450. Leaf and Valen probably got themselves into the top 3 of this category against Leviathan. Aspas was probably going to show up here either way, especially with just how insane this man has been playing the entire stage. But it is kind of funny to see G2 poke their way up to a couple different categories. Moving on to kills per map, Aspas shows up as number 1 once again, just barely edging out Oxy. 21.6 kills per map, barely being at Oxy, 21.5. Bit of a drop to third place, which was Kesnet with 18.3, so still a very solid stat. Moving on to first kills, which is very important for duelist players as well. Oxy does top that list with 93. Again, I want to emphasize Oxy did not go far in playoffs, so the fact that he is at number 1 for a couple different categories just shows how good Oxy was during that regular season stage. Aspas not too far off with 89, and Kesnet 83. Moving on to kill death ratio, this is definitely a stat that does have some discussion within the Valorant community. How important is a kill death ratio? When you're playing a duelist role, it is important for you to get a lot of kills, so you would think that most duelist players should have a high kill death ratio, at least over the 1. Having over the amount of kills that you have death, or having at least even. in. But there is also the argument to be made that the duelist player should probably be the one dying the most, because if you're playing Raze, for example, your job is to dive in, and for Jet as well and other dive agents, it's important for you to dive in, try to get the first kill, and then if you die, as long as you get a trade, then you've given your team value. But with some truly great duelist players, you can see that it doesn't always need to be that way. You can dive in, you can get the kill, but also still stay alive. And we can see Aspas blowing everybody out of the water with the KD ratio 1.51. Absolutely insane numbers from Aspas, so showing that he is getting a lot of kills, getting a lot of value there, but also staying alive. Cryo is a bit of a surprising number 2 in this category, but he did go all the way to the end of the playoffs with 100 Thieves, 1.35 KD ratio for him. Oxy, close third, 1.26, probably dropping a bit in that last match that he played. Moving on to average damage per round, we see Oxy top the list once more, 1.85.6 average damage for him. Aspas with 175.1 average damage. Kisnet shows up once again, he had 167.8 average damage. Moving on to the bottom left of the board, we have K-Max, which is the maximum amount of kills a player got in a single map. Aspas shows up once again with 47. I believe that was against Sentinels. It was just an absolutely crazy match, and Aspas was basically the only reason why Leviton won that game. Oxy shows up at number 2 with 35, which does surprise me a bit. I feel like number 2 would have at least have been 40, but 35 is not a bad number either. Cryo shows up at 3rd place with 33. Moving on to headshot percentage, so amount of shots that you hit the player with that hit the head. Surprisingly enough, we have Havoc with 39% headshot percentage, so while there has been a lot of talk that Havoc hasn't been very good for Furia, I think it's more just a case of Furia as a team is just bad. And I don't particularly think that Havoc has had a good split or anything, but 39 headshot percentage is actually quite good. 2 and 3, we have some EG players. We have Superman at 37%, Apoth as well. So it is kind of interesting to see that all of the usual suspects that we've seen on these stats so far, in Aspas, Oxy, Kesnet, Cryo, none of them show up for this stat, which I guess isn't too surprising because the more matches you play, the more that percentage is probably going to drop, but even so, very impressive numbers by those 3 players. Moving on to clutches, so this is ranked by the amount of clutches won by players, and all 3 of them are from G2. We have Trent 15 out of 75, Valen with 14 out of 70 possible clutches, and then Leaf 12 out of 62. So it's a G2 sweep for clutches. They have 3 players that are very good in that clutch situation. Moving on to first deaths, so this is 1 out of 2 bad stats that I have on the board, but it also is arguable to say that first deaths aren't that big of a deal if you're the duelist player from what I mentioned before with, being the one just diving in and trying to get a kill first, you're probably going to be the first one to die. And all 3 players that show up on this list are duelist players, so not really a huge surprise there, mainly because these players play Raze. Icy got 90 first deaths, which is not very good. I was pretty concerned about Icy early in the season, but he did recover during playoffs and showed some pretty solid skill. Kesnet shows up with 71 and Asuna with a close 69. Nice. Moving on to deaths per map, we have Oxy show up once again. He is tied at 17 with Artzin, so that is the only MIBR player showing up on this board. And then Jogamo at number 3 with 16.7. So those are all the stats that we've went through. It's been a very interesting stage 1, and a lot of these players, I'm not surprised that they're here, but as I said with that video that I made after Madrid, I just find it fun to look at stats, and it's interesting to see the fan reaction, to see what stats they care about, what stats they think is valuable, and just overall what people think of them. So if you enjoyed it, please like this video and comment what you think of all of these stats and how these players performed. Let me know in the comment section down below what other content you want me to do. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.